Queensland Rail acknowledges and pays respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we operate, their elders past and present, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The area our network covers and the land where we produce this podcast was and always will be Aboriginal land. Good day and welcome to another episode of the Queensland Rail History Podcast. I'm Annette, and as always, it's great to have you along with us today as we dive back into the Queensland Rail history vaults. Today, we look back a century ago to 1924 when a very large bridge over a very large river in northern Queensland finally ended a railway construction project that really began in the 1880s.
It's the major railway line and it's the big network in Queensland, connected everything together.
That project, linking Cairns with Brisbane, would go on to become a major railway line and a vital network for Queensland, crucial in the defence of Australia in the Second World War.
A line that connects many regional areas, and even though it's 100 years old, that's still what it does to this day.
We also talk with Rob Shields from the Queensland Museum Rail Workshops and hear about their exhibition that recognises this centennial of the completion of the railway.
That talks about what Queensland was like before the North Coast Line was open and after it was opened.
Be that as it may, we, in common with the whole community, hail with pleasure the inauguration of the railway in Queensland.
An old woman in our carriage was very proud of this little bit of railroad.
G'day and welcome to another episode of the Queensland Rail History Podcast. Greg, can you let us know what we're discussing today?
Well, 2024, it's actually the centenary of the completion of the North Coast Railway line, the final link between Brisbane and Cairns, and that was at Darragee Bridge, which is near Innisfail. And when that bridge was completed and the two steam trains crossed that bridge that day, it has recognised the completion of the bridge. 1,043 miles, which is about 1,700 and something kilometres of railway journey between Brisbane and Cairns, was finally complete. And a person could travel from Brisbane to Cairns or Cairns to Brisbane all the way along the east coast of Queensland by train. So we're going to talk about how that railway came to be basically today, isn't it?
The joining of the patches.
Yes, exactly, yeah. The final cotton being put into place, exactly, isn't it? And to the train travel in the early decades of the 21st century, the construction of a railway line along that eastern seaboard of Queensland, it's possibly seemed one of the most logical ideas for the development of a railway. But as we've learned over the past couple of years doing a Queensland Rail History podcast, railways and logic do not always go together, of course, anyhow. But in that period of the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, the majority of travel between those isolated railway systems of Queensland, it was carried out by coastal shipping.
Greg, I'm wondering why you think it would be a logical idea to build a railway when people could already travel by sea. If something is working, why change it?
Oh, well, at the time, shipping, it formed the basis of all long-distance transport of goods and passengers around coastal Queensland, and Australia for that matter as well too. It was the policy of the government of the 19th century, and what they looked at was basically going from port to paddock. So it was basically the railway was to provide part of that big patchwork of travel in Queensland. And the idea was that along the east coast, you already had a very active shipping industry going. And there was a lot of transport of freight and things like that. And passengers, of course, if they want to go up the east coast of Australia, the preferred way was by steamship. It was a much more luxurious way of travelling, and actually it was a fairly speedy way of travelling as well too. So its comfort and speed was preferred by sea.
Okay, now don't get me wrong. I think it was a great idea they did it, and so did the million or so people who have travelled up on our service. But still, now you're saying that going by steamship was luxury and expensive. How long did it take? And was it cheaper and less luxurious to go by train?
Yeah, it was actually. When they introduced the sleeping carriages on the Queensland Railways in the 1880s and into the 1890s, it was overnight travel. It was a bit of a buster of a trip and everything like that for people. But there was that coordinated service, of course, between the railways, between port and train and that. But for people travelling first class, travel on steamship was much more preferable. It was very quick. You could get up places on the Queensland coast in about 2 or 3 days of travel and everything like that. it was, again, with the departures and things like that. So, going up the East Coast, it was actually preferred, you go up to places. You could go from Brisbane, you could pull in at, major stop was Rockhampton, Mackay, Townsville, Bowen, and all the way up to Cairns. So really, when you think about it, that's the steamship and sea travel. It had travel between ports and up the eastern coast of Queensland. It was already sewn up, literally sort of thing. And not sewn up by canvas sails, it was sewn up by steamships and the travel that went with it. Cost-wise, it was more expensive than travelling by train, but then you traded off, 3 meals a day and everything like that, and what was more an experience than, I guess you'd say, a travel requirement or something like that. Look back over the episodes about how that patchwork railway came to evolve in Queensland. So when we're looking about that from the 1880s through to the early 20th century, the Queensland Railway network, it really consisted of construction of that trunk network of lines. And we mentioned before, port to paddock, heading inland from the coast, joined by ships and everything like that. However, it was actually in 1910. It was pretty late in the piece. The railways began in Queensland. Our first railway journey was 1865. So Annette, we're looking at 45 years, nearly half a century on. That's when an act was finally passed by the Queensland Parliament to actually link up all those railways that went up eastern Queensland, from Bowen, from Mackay, Bundaberg, of course, Rockhampton, Townsville, and to finally link them all up by a seamless form of travel, by train travel from Brisbane through to Cairns. So it's 1910. That's pretty late in the piece, as you can imagine. But again, it was a very comfortable and well-established way of travelling already by steamship along the coast. Well, I guess it's one of those cases. It's already there. We don't really need to go to actually do something of our own initiative or something like that for the railways. So it was 1910. It's really big, being the big development plan for the Queensland Railways. It's probably one of the few huge, big ideas that we've had. And the idea was then to do that building and to construct that railway line along the East Coast. The idea was done in November of 1910. William Kidston, he was the Premier of Queensland, and they introduced Parliament to the legislation. And what they were going to do was it was a big spending spree. And at that stage, the idea was to construct over about 1,700 kilometres of railway in Queensland.
I'm going to ask, why was there a big spending spree at this time?
Oh, it was because of basically the government of the day was a big railway. The Kidston government was big on idea of development, but they were very railway friendly, I guess you'd say. And they saw the railway as this big way to connect Queensland. And it was finally the big way that all these railways, the 9 and 10 networks scattered throughout Queensland, to finally link them up and give almost like a seamless form of travel by train throughout Queensland. Yeah, so William Kidston, he was very, very railway friendly and came up with this grand idea, North Coast line, and then out in the far west, the Great Western Railway line that never quite came to be. But it was going to be out in the outback, Tobermory to Camberwell and places like that. And then the railway actually on the North Coast was going to go from Brisbane to Cairns. And Brisbane to Cairns was actually the second thought. The big emphasis was on that Great Western Railway, which is out in the far, far west of Queensland. And that was one that was more important rather than linking up what was already there, I should say, Annette.
Okay, so the North Coast line was second choice. Why? I would imagine that going from Brisbane to Cairns would be popular with passengers and definitely a great freight link.
You'd think so. Again, 21st century, and we're looking back at well over a century or plenty of years more. It was just that thing there, what was established. And the other thing too is we just don't want to think quite in the isolation of things because, people could go from Melbourne. They come up to Cairns for the winter periods and that. So travelling throughout Australia by steamship was well established, and going from Melbourne through to Cairns by ship take 2 weeks or something like that. That was all part of the journey and everything like that went with it. But it was Kidston government decided, railways was important for Queensland, for connecting Queensland, and the North Coast Railway Act of 1910, and it was to complete what was Australia's longest state railway. That's within the state.
Okay, so do we still have claim to Australia's longest railway?
Yeah, we've still got that one claim to our fame anyway, Annette, definitely. So I think it's about 1,700 kilometres of rail, Brisbane to Cairns, and that was all within the one state. It was going to be a big project anyway, and bring it all together into the single network.
No, that's cool. So we completed our patchwork blanket.
Of course, anyway, with a bit of quilting attached to it as well too. So actually, December 21st, the legislation goes before Parliament, and Parliament approved 2 major railway acts. Now, this was that Great Western I mentioned before. We've got the North Coast. It's about 2,800 kilometres of Queensland. It's big. This is a really big railway project. And basically, when you total it all together, it's sort of like the distance between Adelaide and Darwin. So the Transcontinental Railway that was built from Alice Springs to the Darwin in the 1990s, beginning of the 21st century, that's a big one. But it's almost double that. You're almost looking at double from, as we mentioned before, Adelaide and Darwin being built here in Queensland at that stage. So, I mean, there's a lot of Vegemite on this toast, I can tell you, when it came to this sort of big railway idea that went with it, isn't it?
I'm going to say, not that our navvies would have eaten the Vegemite.
Well, you never know. So, Vegemite is taken from brewed materials. The brewed stuff, the navvies would have drunk that, of course, as we know, and discussed in the past. Yeah.
So you didn't actually say about it being the longest?
Yeah, at the time, the Queensland Railways in the beginning of the 20th century, we had the largest railway network in Queensland. That's in Commonwealth of Australia. That's on a mileage basis. So basically, we had more railways per mile than any other part of any other state or territory in Australia at that stage.
So the largest in the Commonwealth. When did we lose the title?
Oh, it's been lost over the past 20, 30 years, basically, anyway, isn't it? So the numbers are still pretty good for us anyway.
I've worked at the rail workshops for 18 years.
That's our special guest for today's episode, Rob Shields, curator from the Queensland Museum Rail Workshops.
I did an arts degree at university and I majored in history. And at the end of that, the only two things I knew were I didn't want to be a history teacher, but I loved history and that was my passion. After that, I front a house job for one of the Thomas the Tank Engine school holiday events at the museum. And I haven't left since. So after that, I sort of did some work with the exhibition and display team. I'd been the education officer. I was the collection manager for many years. And the last few years, I've been the curator. Oh, my goodness. So you've really worked your way up there. Yeah, you could say that. And you didn't want to be a history teacher. Did you have a passion for a particular kind of history? Modern history. I was never that particularly sweet on ancient history. It's perfectly good history, but for me, modern history is what I'm interested in. And railways, the last 160 years, to me, that's very much modern history. So I think it's a pretty good fit. Greg and I have been discussing the centenary of the North Coast Line. Why do you think this final connecting link to the railway was a significant milestone for Queensland? Well, it was about 40 years in the making. And it really meant that Queensland was a connected state. So you had 3 separate railway divisions when they first started building it in the 1880s. And by 1924, it meant those 3 individual railway divisions, North, Central and Southern, were all connected. So the whole state of Queensland was connected, at least north to south, by one railway line. Queensland was very reliant on maritime transport. So without a connected railway or connected roads, the state needed maritime transport to move people north to south, and goods had to be moved via ships instead of trains. So it really restricted economic development in the north particularly because they were trying to establish farming and without being able to get the produce to market in a timely fashion, the produce would spoil. So they started a banana industry, for example, in North Queensland, and it really floundered because they just couldn't get the bananas to the southern markets in time before they spoiled on the ships. So railways were a reliable and cheap form of transport, particularly to move produce. Yeah, but at that time it was still like 3 days to get from Cairns down, wasn't it, on the railway? Yeah, 3 days, but, a ship from Brisbane to Cairns is 5 or 6 or 7 days. The other thing is as we all know, it's incredibly risky and dangerous to travel on a ship in Queensland during cyclone season. And that became abundantly clear when the SS Yongala was sunk in 1911 and everyone was killed on board. That happened in March. So that really brought home the need that Queensland needed a railway line all the way up the coast because you just couldn't rely on ships to do what you needed to do. And the government was particularly resentful of shipping because it was owned by private industry. So these massive profits were going to private companies when the government ideally would be getting revenue from helping the people move around the state and move their produce throughout the state as well. There's another aspect about how important the line was in 1924, and that's Australia's paranoia and fear about invasion. So as a young country, after 1900, Australia is very, very paranoid and scared of an invasion from Asia. And after the First World War, this paranoia and fear really heightens. Really heightens. And as Queensland is geographically the closest state to Asia, Queensland in particular was fearful of a potential invasion. So the building of a railway line that connects the north to the south gave people a sense of protection and they thought, well, at least troops could move from the south to the north of the state if they needed to go up there.
Yeah, and then the people could move south as the troops went up as well.
That's right. And that's exactly what happens in the Second World War. So all those fears that people had came true in December 1941 when Japan waged war on America, and all of a sudden Queensland felt very, very isolated and at risk to invasion.
Oh, that makes a big difference, being connected like that. And you don't think about it as a protection, you just think about it as a convenience, really, don't we? So it's a different aspect to think about.
Okay, so how are we going to pull it all together? Well, we've got to look at the railway systems. They're based at Rockhampton, you've got Brisbane, you've got the Bundaberg Railways tucked in there in the old Maryborough district out to places like Monto and that. Now, all that southern part have been linked in 1903. Your outliers are the northern systems. They're based on Mackay, they're based on Townsville, they're based on Bowen and Cairns. They're still the isolated systems. So really your north coastline is actually going to go from Rockhampton all the way through to Cairns. That's going to be the big building work to stitch it all up there together. Numbers. We've got to have numbers, as we know, and statistics. So North Coast Railway Act, 740 kilometres of line is going to link Cairns to Brisbane. That's new line to be built. That's patching everything together. Take until 1924 to be completed, 14 years of work. It went through mostly coastal country, and the economic, I guess you'd say, potential line, it wasn't a high priority. This is a big connector, if anything. You know, there wasn't thought about, will it help, well, does it relate to the pastoral industries? Is there mining involved or something like that? You know, traditional things of railway. It's going through coastal country and, you know, sugar plantations are scattered in Queensland, but they're not all the way. So, yeah, it wasn't seen as even a big economically much potential in that line. It's all about connecting. It's all about pulling the threads together. The interesting thing, although that's the thing at the beginning of the 20th century, by the mid-1940s, actually, it was the North Coast line, Brisbane, Cairns. It's the major railway line and it's the big network in Queensland, you know, connected everything together.
Yeah, well, that's what Queensland Rail's all about, connecting communities.
Oh, yes, it is too, yes.
But I'm interested with how times have changed. Like, anything coastal now is really popular and expensive. I doubt we could complete anything like this work today.
Well, it was a huge step. Like Kidston actually said when he announced when the line was going to be built, he said, well, it's a huge step. But he said, Queensland, you know, at that stage, Queensland's got to have the big heart to do with the big railway. That's how he described it. The papers, it was actually announced on Christmas Day, Christmas Eve in 1910. All the newspapers said, oh, this is a big Christmas gift for Queensland. It's a very expensive one too, I must admit. So that was the decision that was made. They made a good start on it. Between 1910 to 1915, they built about 1,572 miles. That's in the old currency. There's a lot of rural branch lines, which was the idea to promote farming and closer settlement. At that stage, that raised the total system route length from 3,890 miles 1911 to 6,357 miles in 1924. So it came very close. It was getting close to doubling the amount of railway there in about 12, 13 years. The other thing is that period, 1921, 1931, Queensland's railway expansion, it was the highest in Australia. It was the most amount of track that was being laid. So it was big railway country.
So we almost doubled our network between 1911 and 1924. But then between 1921 and 1931, Queensland had the largest expansion in Australia.
We were really building a lot, yeah. The other thing too, a lot of the other states they were railway populated. There was not really much requirement to build railways any longer for that connection and connectivity and things like that. Queensland was still progressing through that stage of trying to get that transport connection throughout the state. Yeah.
So we were catching up.
Yes, exactly. Well done. Yeah, snails and tortoises. It was established ports and towns along the east coast. They were waiting for the railway line to finally get to them. Now, in other parts of Australia, when they built the Trans-Australian Railway during the Great War across the Nullarbor, and that was all about desert. Queensland, of course, different. This time around, we've got flooding rivers, we've got monsoons, we've got the wet in the north. You've got lots of green jungle up around Tully and the wet tropics area and that. They're going to contend anyone building that railway line. You've got to deal with snakes, mosquitoes, crocodiles, of course, or alligators, as they were called back then.
We all know them as crocodiles, so now.
Well, in this part of it, yes, but they still call them alligators, but who cares? Something's got big teeth and it's going to bite you. I'm quite sure you could call it anything you like, Annette, anyway.
I'd call it a run.
A very quick run too, yes. And the faster the better as well.
I only have to outrun you, Greg.
No, you can do that by 1.5 miles, I could tell you, anyway, or 3 kilometres. Anyway, so navvies, engineers, it's going to be a big construction job crossing rivers and that. And the other thing was we paid for it. There was no federal loan money or anything like that. It was Queensland going it alone yet again. We negotiated the loans and we have to get the money to build this railway.
Okay, so you said before that a £10 million loan had been negotiated.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know how much was actually borrowed?
The whole box and dice.
The whole box and dice. We borrowed £10 million to build the railway.
Mm-hmm.
Wowies.
Mm-hmm.
And I know not really your wheelhouse, but I'm curious, how long did Queensland take to pay it all back?
I think it was about 50 or 60 years. Yeah, so it was a long time, but big building projects tend to do that. Now, because we're in the early part of the 20th century, we're in the realm of the engineers and things like that, and there's 5 sections of railway line that they're going to build to pull that final thread work and that. It's all very wonderful. Section A, B, C, D, E, okay?
So original.
We are. We are in the realm of the engineer, thank you, the surveyor. A is from Rockhampton to a point north of St. Lawrence. So it's just a point. It's a line on a map. It's a dot.
I love the way it's not to St. Lawrence.
No.
But a point north
of St. Lawrence. Exactly. So 124 miles in the old currency. That's just over 200 kilometres. B is from Section A, terminal point. I love that word, terminal point, okay? And that's actually to go north again to Mackay, and that's about 122 miles. So again, what's that, about 220 kilometres in the modern currency. Then from Section B's terminal point, yet again, and we go through Bowen, and that point we get to the southern bank of the Burdekin River. So that's around the Home Hill area and stuff like that. They're also taking over one of the Shire-owned tram lines that's on the coast as well. That's the Proserpine Tramway. And that section's about 68 miles. So we're looking at probably about 110 kilometres or something like that.
Okay, so in the expansion of the railway, we killed off the trams in Proserpine?
Well, technically not trams. It was a tramway, but it was owned by the local shire, basically, anyway. But we acquired it anyway. We subsumed it, okay?
We ran it over.
Actually, we got a very good engine or two out of it as well, but it's actually part of the North Coast line today, part of that line, around Proserpine. Section C, terminal point yet again, and that takes over the air tramway. And I know where you're going to go with this, Annette, and that goes up to a point near Cardwell that's 135 miles.
So we took over Ayers Tramway too?
It doesn't stop there. And the final section is Section D, which is the terminal point. We're taking over the Cairns-Mulgrave Tramway to Cairns, and that's another 125 miles. So it's all about, these new sections are about 220 kilometres more or less, Annette.
So don't tell me. But we're responsible for the tramway in Cairns as well.
We still run on part of that railway. We do in this day and age. But the local shires, they were quite happy for the government to take over their private railways, I suppose you'd say. They weren't all very profitable and that. And yes, so they're going to be part of the Queensland Railways. That's fine. Okay. We're more than happy as the ratepayer. You can take over that, please.
Well, we were joining up the coast, so they're getting more and more for giving us their tramways. It's making it even more busy. So
that's exactly right. So it was on a day labour, they called it, and day labour is employed directly by the railway department. So they're employed by day. It's not like in the old days, the railway contractors and things like that had, lots of navvies. Going back to the 1860s, the 1880s, it was that imported workforce and the navvies and that. They're actually employed by the Queensland Railways themselves. So it's pretty much the railways are building their own railways. They're supplying their own labour that went with it as well.
Okay, so what do you actually mean? Do you mean there was no more navvy camps?
Oh, no, Annette, no. The camps that went with them still went with them. The main thing was like the railways were responsible, so they had the paymasters, you had the railway engineers looking after things. And what happened was in the navvy days, the contractors, you didn't get regular payments or anything like that, a lot of strikes. But every 4 weeks, you got paid money, real money, vouchers to go pay things. And the other thing is the Temperance Society, which is a temperance organisation, the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association, they actually were contracted to cater for the camps and to housekeep. So it's a temperance organisation, and you've got an idea of these day labourers, and shall we say, their thirsty habits and things like that. So they were brought in to keep order and everything like that.
They were just helping make Vegemite, Greg.
I'm sure they were, and enjoying it every day too. So they had their day labour numbers, the employers. There were immigrants coming in from Britain at that stage, and they'd literally get off the ship, and then they go to some point, they go as a group or something like that to some location, build a railway. So one day, a couple of months before, you might have been in Birmingham or someplace like that. Next thing you're basically north of Bowen or somewhere like that, helping build a railway line. It would have been a cultural shock, I'd suppose they'd say,
Yeah, definitely what a welcome to Australia. It must have really felt like another planet.
It would have, I imagine it would have, and welcome to Queensland as well.
What were some of the challenges in building the North Coastline, and why do you think it took so long?
Well, the biggest hurdle was geography, so much more than distance. So the line was 1,678 kilometres long, but a slightly longer line was built between Port Augusta and Kalgoorlie between 1912 and 1917, but this only took 5 years to build because it was pretty much just on flat ground. Whereas Queensland, we had such a wide variety of landscapes to sort of overcome and building the railway. The line alone had 1,800 bridges that had to be built, whereas in WA, they just had flat ground, no bridges, so you could just keep going. Queensland, there were so many watercourses to build over, and as we know, the state is very susceptible to flooding. So many of these bridges and bits of the line were built, and then a big flood would come through, knock them over, and they would have to get rebuilt. There was difficulty in the 1890s because there was a worldwide economic collapse and Queensland was basically bankrupt. So that slowed a lot of the building. They basically stopped in 1903 when they got to Rockhampton, and they didn't pick up work again until 1910 with the passing of the North Coast Railway Act. So in 1903, many people sort of considered the job done for a while. If you could have said in the 1880s you'll have a railway from Brisbane to Rockhampton, I think a lot of people would have been happy with that and thought that was an incredible achievement. But after 1910, they decided to push on and connect the Central Division to the Northern Division, but it took them 7 years to decide that, so that took a little bit of time. You've also got World War I in there, which led to incredible shortages of workers and also material. When the war was on, it was incredibly difficult to get steel to build a railway. It just so happens that the resources you need to build a railway are the same resources you need to wage war, and the war took precedence. So there was a lot that was sort of happening in the background that was going on, as well as overcoming incredibly difficult geography.
Anyway, so that was it. So I started off. It's no easy time to build a railway because guess what? They start this and then Europe, the Great War breaks out, the First World War. There were a lot of Queenslanders went off to fight. There was, about 57,000 went off enlisted, 6,850 died, 15,950 are wounded. So a lot of people who would have been employed to build a railway or keep a railway running, they're enlisted fighting overseas. Politically, we got the big debates in 1916-17 about conscription, divided Australian society. Guess what? We've got rising prices, rising interest rates, social unrest because the unions basically were pushing for higher wages for workers and things like that, cost of living crisis. And there's another big drought as well too. It's not a good time or a very easy time to be building a railway for yourself.
No, it sounds like a very tough time to be building the longest railway line in the Commonwealth.
Well, that's exactly right. But anyway, so guess what happened, of course? Lack of manpower, materials, and there's no money. That slows down the north coastline. So Marlborough, which is north of St. Lawrence, that famous St. Lawrence, they didn't hear the whistle of a train, from Yamba until 31st of March 1917. So it's taken a couple of years.
What was the original timeline to get to Yamba?
I think it was about 3 years or something like that. So things are slipping. Then it took another 3 years to get across the Styx River and all the tidal mudflats up in north of St. Lawrence and those areas. And then it's another 12 months before the line finally even opened through to St. Lawrence, and that was in 1921. It's tough going. And I think the thing was, people in 1910, we'll get this built, out west, far western Queensland, trying to build the Great Western, and here's the North Coast going plod, 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 basically, in it. So, yeah.
So did they start work on the Great Western? I thought you said they scrapped that one.
No, it wasn't scrapped. The work was never completed. And up until 1980s, if you look at the old annual reports of the Commissioner for Queensland Railways, there's dotted lines out in that far west, approved but never built. They did build sections of it out to Quilpie, Yarraka, Dajara, and a couple of other places. They built the spur lines, they called them, but the connection bit, it never happened. Survey pigs are out there. I've seen them. I've seen the survey pigs for the line and everything like that. I've seen the maps and the survey reports, but never happened in that.
How far behind did they end up be? If they only opened the St. Lawrence in 1921, how many years behind were they?
The original section of the North Coastline is that section in Brisbane from Northgate to Caboolture and eventually on to Gympie and that. If you want to look at it that way, Annette, going north Brisbane, Cairns, and you're looking at 40 years. So it's 40 years really from Northgate heading north to finally Darragee Bridge. It's a long time.
Sorry, so 40 years to get there. So realistically, they're about 30 years late, right?
Yeah, well, it depends sort of thing. But go back in time, originally trying to get to Gympie. You're thinking about building a railway line through to Gympie. That's like that first section in the 1880s. We spoke about horse coaches and horse travel in another one of our podcasts. To get on those sections on the North Coastline, you basically had to take a horse coach. Sometimes when the contractors were building the line up to Gympie and those areas, contractors sometimes allow you to travel on a ballast wagon.
A ballast wagon. I can't imagine that would have been incredibly comfortable.
Definitely not. But then again, if you want to get through, you're willing to take the risk, so be it sort of thing.
Take the risk.
That's right. Now, when the line got through to Gladstone, it was 1903, that final snippet between Gladstone and Rockhampton was completed. Queensland Railways, of course, they ran their own paddle steamers. Thank you very much. We had captains in the Queensland Railways in the early part of the 20th century, late 1890s. You get on a paddle ship and you head through the mud flats to get to Rockhampton. And then, of course, we've got the coastal steamers. So if you're going north from Rockhampton up to Cairns and that, you'd have about 2 days and nights on a coastal steamer. Your steamers are back in the story again, Annette.
Greg, this trip is sounding tougher with every sentence. So you start off on a train and then you're on a horse coach, if you're lucky and not walking, back to a train and then a paddle steamer. Please tell me what's next.
It don't get easy. Now, between the gap in the railway that was between St. Lawrence and Camilla in North Queensland, the choice apart from walking was the bumpy ride in actually an early model motorbus, okay? And what you had to go was go through the scrub, you go across tidal creeks and things like that. But that's another option. You got a rough trip in an old motor bus and that. Eyre, which is on the Burdekin River. Okay, slight problem. Largest river in Queensland, isn't it, sort of thing? Okay. Burdekin River comes up and floods a lot and a huge amount. But there was a way to get through that, of course. You go in a whale boat.
A whale boat. Are you talking about a ship that used to be used for whaling?
No, I'm not talking a ship in it. I'm talking a rowboat, a very large rowboat, okay, a whale boat. And that's fine because you go across a flooded river in a whale boat, go from one side of the Burdekin to join the train journey on the other side. During a flood on the Burdekin River, largest river in Queensland, and the river rises and there, could be up to 17, 18 metres or something like that.
Gee, this sounds so much fun, Greg.
I know it does, sort of thing.
Let's take a rowboat across a flooded river. This just sounds grand.
It does, sort of thing. Look, if that was too much for you, you could go for another day and night and you could go travel by train from Rockhampton to Longreach. After 1928, you could go to Winton, then up to Hewenden, and then from Hewenden, you could go back through to Charters Towers, to Townsville, and continue north.
Wow, I thought my comment was a joke. Then moved to walking, an early bus, and then a whaleboat.
Yes, exactly right. They bred them tough in those days, they did. So,
And we're not even in Cairns yet.
of course, we're nowhere near Cairns at this stage yet, Annette, anyway. Next time you're on the Spirit of Queensland, Annette, remember this, please, Section E, now that's only 75 miles. That's a very short length. It's, 75, 120 kilometres, thereabout. That's between Babinda and Cardwell. It's not too far, is it? Trouble. It's in Australia's wettest region. It's around Tully. It's the wet tropics and things like that. They had 65 men working in the labour gangs, and they're going through rainforest. They're going through also some cane that have been planted in the area. But there's other things that are along the way they've got to contend with, apart from disease and that. You've got snakes, you've got spiders, you've got mosquitoes and all sorts of nasty things as well too. So to build through that jungle, to build a railway line.
And 65 men, that seems like a really small workforce to be building such a major rail line.
I think it says something about the conditions and everything like that. And I think the other thing too, by this stage, it's post-First World War, so I think that fellas that had come back from fighting overseas have been in the AIF pretty tough. And I mean, maybe half the trauma they've been through building a railway, maybe in comparison, building a railway to what they'd seen, overseas or Western Front and that, it might have seemed too difficult for them as well too, isn't it?
Yeah, but those poor navvies, I bet most of them hadn't even seen a snake before starting in the railway.
I imagine some of them wouldn't if they'd come to Queensland more recently. The other big thing, of course, is tropical disease. Now, Yubanganji Swamp, there was malaria. They called it yellowjack fever back then. It was rife, so there was malaria in northern Queensland. They used to have stories, and it was pretty sad. They said, look, able-bodied men, they're stricken like babies from malaria. Actually, an innovation was a small railway ambulance or a rail ambulance trolley, and used to take the malarial victims from their camp, which is at Babinda, south of Cairns, and then they'd go to Cairns. So that was for the workers and things like that in the malarial areas and those sorts of things.
I do hope they were paid a generous wage dealing with all of the obstacles.
Actually, they were, because they were employed by the department. They were given pretty good pay and everything like that went with it. And they had a lot of other conditions, like they did get their holiday pays and things like that. So they were employed as departmental things, which is a lot better than even 30 or 40 years before with that. Okay, so Babinda, we're in the tropical north. There's a town called Mooloolaba then, not Mooloolaba, but Mooloolaba. It was renamed Porngilly. So they completed that section Babinda south in 1912 and then it stops. And that was because, look, rather than trying to build south from Cairns and that, there's more important jobs to build out, and that was south at Townsville. And the really big one was getting across the North Johnson River near Innisfail. And that was a big bridge that had to be built. And with the lack of numbers and, lack of material and things like that was going on, it basically stopped construction work on that section from Babinda south for about another 6 years. And finally, coming north from Babinda, Cairns, down towards Innisfail there. And it wasn't until December of 1919 that the railway lines finally got to the riverbank at Darragee on the North Johnson Bridge, and that's 51 miles from Cairns. So that's not even 100 kilometres south from Cairns.
No, we're getting so close.
Slowly but surely, or surely but slowly, exactly. What had happened was the rails got to the northern section of the Darragee Bridge, and then coming up, it's come up through Cardwell and it's come up through places like that. It's coming north. And finally, the big section, that missing bit, is the Darragee Bridge. It's at North Johnson River, there at Innisfail. Actually, Cardwell, when the line opened there weren't really official openings or things like that. Like the line was just open. Even around St. Lawrence, when that section was completed, they drove a last spike, but it wasn't a silver spike, it wasn't a gold spike or anything like that. I just had a bit of there was just an event, a ceremony there to drive that spike, and that's it, get the line open. So, yeah, there's no grand celebrations really that went with it. When the line went through Cardwell, it was a bit different, and they actually, the government concentrated on Darragee, the final big ticket item, I suppose you'd say, the big thing, the big bridge. Cardwell, however, but when the line got through there, they said, no, we got the line here. This is in 1924. Nope, we're recognising our railway at last, and we're going to celebrate as a result anyway.
Okay. So did the railway help with the celebrations at least?
Yeah, well, in October of 1924, they ran 4 picnic trains. They ran 100 miles from Townsville south. That's, 170 kilometres. They reckon about 6,000 people turned out, and Mrs. John Hubinger, who was the daughter of a blacksmith, one of the original settlers in the area, she actually drove that final spike, and basically that showed at that point that coming from Townsville down and through Cardwells and those areas, you could now travel by train all that way. So that's October of 1924, okay? So it's not too far off final completion.
Now, can you tell us about the celebration that took place on the completion of the line?
It was an enormous event that took place at the Duraji Bridge over the North Johnston River near Innisfail on December the 8th, 1924. We think it was attended between 6,000 and 10,000 people, and you had trains bringing people down from Cairns and the Atherton Tableland, as well as trains bringing people up from Charters Towers and Townsville for the celebration. So that bridge was the very last piece of infrastructure that needed to be completed for the whole North Coast line to be completed. It took 2.5 years to build, so the bridge and the river made a very scenic, symbolic backdrop to this celebration.
Yeah, well, it's like a linking, really, over the waters.
Yeah, so there's a lot of symbolism in it, and the Premier was there, Premier Ted Theodore, who had been a railway man, and he said that this day is one of the red-letter days of my career. It was a monumental day for Queensland, one of the biggest days in the state's history because of what it represented. It finally represented a solid link from the north to the south of the state. It's a big day for North Queensland as well, because up until that date there'd been a lot of sentiment about separating the north ceding from the south. And now that there was a link, a permanent link connecting the very north of the state to the south, that type of talk sort of starts to dissolve a little bit. It still goes on for a while, but not in any serious fashion. It was noted at the time by the Premier that it was a great day for white Australia. He praised the white people who'd gone up to North Queensland to colonise it and talk about their pioneering spirit and what a great job they'd done. But he didn't mention how the line or the colonisation had affected any Indigenous people or how the line had affected their communities, which I think is important to note as well.
So you said that the celebration was attended by 6,000 to 10,000 people. Do you have any idea what the population of Queensland would have been at that time?
Yeah, it's 800,000 people in Queensland 1924, and that's why this event was so meaningful and so significant. It's a very small state in terms of population, but it's a very big state in terms of distances. So by the time the North Coast lines opened in 1924, Queensland has built twice as many railway lines or distance as New South Wales, and they've done it for half the price because they use 3'6" gauge. So it's an enormous economic as well as engineering achievement.
Yeah, well, even a social achievement, honestly, linking north and south.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we get back. Guess what? The final link, the final bridge over railway troubled waters. It's the North Johnston River. And once we've finished that bridge, it's about 1,680 kilometre track of railway between Brisbane and Cairns, 1,700 kilometres. I actually began planning that Duraji Bridge. The plans for it in 1918. It was to be a structure 23 metres above the riverbed, above the flood level. It's 10.6 metres above the summer high water level mark, so that's floods and things like that during the monsoon.
Yep, substantially higher than the creek, the river at this time, yep.
Exactly. It's around about 196 metres in length. You've got 3 timber approaches. You've got 3 big steel trusses on it. One is 24 metres in long. There's one that's 40 metres. There's one that's 61 metres. And this was the last, and it was among the longest steel sections used on a Queensland Railway bridge. So it's a big structure that we're looking at, to go across the North Johnston River.
Yeah, this bridge sounds like a big challenge for the time.
Oh, you're right, Annette. It was, yeah. So in April 1922, construction, they begin on both sides of the river. It takes 2.5 years.
Sorry, 2.5 years to build a bridge.
Yeah.
Although it did take us 40 years to build a rail line.
Well, basically to connect it all up. Yeah, exactly, Annette. So we're grateful for small mercies, I suppose. 300 workers on it. They floated the main span into position, which we have photos of, showing that span being floated in position. And they floated that on the 31st of October. They lowered it onto the bearings, which is on the bridge. So they used to float out in a barge or something, wait till the high water. When the high water went down, the span would float neatly into place on the bridge piers and everything like that, all nicely into place. And they did that on the 4th of November of 1924, and they completed all the rest of the bridging works 3 weeks later.
So, Greg, 2 years to build a bridge.
2.5 years. Yes, exactly, Annette, anyway. So, here it comes. Monday morning, it's the 8th of December, it's 1924. There's an enthusiastic crowd. They come in special trains from Townsville, Charter's, Cairns, the Atherton, Tableland, Mareeba and places like that. They come for the opening ceremony. They're all along the riverbanks, huge crowds, and they see the two inaugural trains that represent the north and the south, coming together. And they wait, and the bridge is covered in flags, of course, and everything like that. And they're waiting for the big moment, the official trains to finally cross the north and south and bring the railway line between Brisbane and Cairns to ultimate completion.
Yeah, I can imagine the excitement after waiting since 1910 for it to reach this far.
Exactly, and that was what a lot of people said in the same time as well too. So it was a huge day. Innisfail turned out big time. They had their brass band out to play. Newspapers of the day described the crowd watching. They erupted in wild cheers, as the train from Townsville moved towards the celebratory ribbon stretched across the rails. The Townsville train was hauled by a C-17 class locomotive, number 253. One of those engines was actually built at Evans Anderson and Phelan Foundry in Kangaroo Point in Brisbane. From the north, the track wasn't as heavy or anything like that. It's lighter. It's a small B-13 class steam locomotive, and it's at the head of the train from Cairns. As in common with the opening days, they're highly decorated. They've got special bunting. They're polished until the boilers and brasswork gleam. And on the smoke box of the locomotives, they put on coats of arms of Queensland. And then keeping with the North Queensland theme, they decorated them with palm fronds and sugarcane.
I love the sustainable decorations.
I'm sure you would. Even more importantly, Annette, I bet you would have loved to have been there for the big day as well.
So many people turned out to celebrate.
They did, sort of thing. They knew it was an epoch making. They knew it was a big moment in history, Annette.
For those who have no knowledge about the museum, can you tell us a little bit about the rail workshops, what to expect and why it's worth checking out?
Yeah, well, the Queensland Museum Rail Workshops is at the Ipswich Railway Workshops, which was the birthplace of rail in Queensland. And the Ipswich Railway Workshops were for many years the largest industrial enterprise in Queensland. Thousands of people used to work there. The museum was opened in 2002. And we've got displays about the development of the railway in Queensland, people who worked at the Ipswich Railway Workshops, as well as displays about technology and innovation over 160 years of railway technology. We are very well known for our annual Thomas the Tank Engine event, which we do in the summertime. We've now done well over 20 of them, and I'm happy to say we'll be doing another one this summer. I'm sure many people have sort of been along with their kids during the Thomas the Tank Engine events.
Yep, I'm sure. And you forgot my favourite part. You have a cafe on site.
We do have a cafe, yes. Cafe was based in the original workers' dining hall, which was built in 1911. When I first started, we only had 4 Thomas songs on the PA.
Oh.
And I actually worked out how many times a day it played and then how many times it actually played over the 6 weeks we were doing the event. And it was like 100,000 times each.
You mentioned that you've put on several exhibitions at the museum. Do you have a favourite one? What are some coming up?
Yeah, right now we've got an exhibition called The Sunshine Route, 100 Years of the North Coast Line, which is our sort of exhibition commemorating the North Coast Line. So that we opened that earlier this year, and that'll run till the end of 2025. That talks about what Queensland was like before the North Coast Line was open and after it was opened. It talks about the people who lived on the line and built the line and went through a lot of challenges, had to live out in the bush and build this railway. Then for the train buffs, we talk about the trains that ran along the North Coastline, like the Sunshine Route, the Sunlander, the Queenslander, and just for a few short years, the Great South Pacific Express. So there's lots of great photos in there, some great sort of 70s nostalgia. We've got objects in the exhibition, crockery and cutlery that was used on the onboard services from the trains, and we've also got some uniforms that workers wore on those services as well. And finally, the exhibition talks about the importance of the North Coast Line to regional Queensland. So it's a line that connects many regional areas. And even though it's 100 years old, that's still what it does to this day. So that's our sort of newest, biggest and brightest exhibition. Probably my favourite little exhibition is about our Hunslet locomotive, which was a locomotive built in the UK for service on the Western Front during the First World War, managed to survive the war, got sent back to England for refurbishment after the war, and then was bought by the Queensland government to work in the sugarcane fields of Queensland.
Oh, how was that shipped out here? Because we talk about a lot of our trains came almost flat pack, but if it's an existing refurbished train, did they send it out nice and whole under a tarp?
Yeah, it was just sent out with a bunch of other ones, and they were sort of ex-war surplus. They worked on the Queensland sugarcane fields. Our locomotive worked the North Eaton Mill and then went to a park for many, many, many years. And then it was donated to the museum in 2005. And between 2012 and 2017, we worked with Queensland Rail's heritage volunteers who were working at the Ipswich Railway workshops next door, and we restored the locomotive back to its original sort of 1916 appearance.
Oh, wow.
And then we moved it into the museum. So I had a lot to do with that, so that's my favourite exhibition.
Yeah, I can tell your face is actually lit up while we're talking about this train. Yeah. Why do you think the railway between Brisbane and Cairns is still so important over 100 years on?
Well, I think more than anything, it helps to connect the places between Brisbane and Cairns. Yeah, you can jump on the train and get up to Cairns in 27 hours, 28 hours and go see tropical Queensland and have an awesome holiday. That's great. But you can also do that by flying. But what the line really does is it helps connect huge parts of regional Queensland to other parts of Queensland. So the people who get on the train in Bundaberg and take the tilt train down to Brisbane for medical appointments, things like that. That's what the line still does to this day. It still does what we wanted it to do 100 years ago. It's connecting people and places in an incredibly vast state.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Rob. I'm just wondering, is there a location that people can go to find out more information about the museum?
Thanks for having me. And people should check out our website, which is museum.qld.gov.au, and look for the Rail Workshop section.
So that's the story. So with one bridge, and it's all completed at the North Johnstone River. On December of 1924, it was completed. And December of 2024 will be that century, the 100 years since the completion of the railway line between Brisbane and Cairns. Yeah.
What a substantial achievement.
Yeah, so, as I said, it was a big bridge work, and it was progress and prosper back then. So obviously there's been a lot of progress and hopefully a bit of prosperity since then as well too, Annette.
Yeah, well, that line is still running, unlike many in Queensland.
That's exactly right. And guess what? The line that was thought as a bit of an afterthought is probably the primary railway line in Queensland Rail's network in this day and age in the 21st century, Annette.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Greg. It's been great chatting with you again today.
As Annette, it's always a delight to chat with you too.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode on the North Coast Line. A big thank you to our special guest, Rob, from the Queensland Museum Rail Workshops. If you have any questions about our rail history, please email Greg. He would love to hear from you. history@qr.com.au. And if you're enjoying what you're hearing, please leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you, what you love about the podcast and what you would like us to feature in a future episode. You've been listening to the Queensland Rail History Podcast, hosted by our historian, Greg Hallam, and myself, Annette.